A war veteran and his dog returned to a house no one had entered for 30 years. The floor was rotting. The air was frozen with old silence. For decades, Callum believed he had lost everything: his mother, his home, his family, and even God's attention. Then the dog stopped, ears up, body tense, digging at one single spot in the floor. Beneath the broken boards lay a box that was never meant to be found. Letters written by a mother who never stopped loving, and proof that a grandfather had been waiting all along. Why was the truth buried for 30 years? What kind of faith survives that long in silence? And how did this forgotten house of stone later save an entire town? Stay with me. And before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. The winter night of 1961 lay heavy and still, the air brittle with cold and memory. Snow clung to bare trees like forgotten promises, and the abandoned house stood in silence, its dark windows staring outward as if it had been waiting all along. Callum stopped just short of the doorway, his boots half buried in frozen earth. At 45, he carried the build of a man shaped by endurance rather than comfort, broad shoulders slightly bowed forward, as if accustomed to bearing weight that never fully lifted. His face was sharply defined, the lines around his mouth etched by years of restraint. His jaw square beneath a short, uneven beard streaked with early gray. His eyes, a muted steel blue, held the guarded stillness of someone who had learned not to expect gentleness from the world. He did not rush inside. Men who survived long campaigns learned to listen before moving, to read silence as carefully as terrain. At his side stood Buster, a German shepherd whose once glossy black and tan coat had dulled with age and travel. The dog was large but lean, his frame still powerful, his muzzle lightly dusted with white. His amber eyes were alert, steady, trained long ago to remain calm under pressure. Buster had served with Callum in war zones, where noise meant danger and stillness meant survival. Now he waited without command, instinctively sensing that this place carried more than rot and cold. The house had once been modest but cared for. Now it sagged inward, its porch collapsed, the door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. When Callum pushed it open, the sound was louder than expected, a long groan of wood protesting after decades of neglect. Inside, the air smelled of mold, damp iron, and old paper. Each step forward felt like entering a space his body remembered, even when his mind resisted. This was where he had lived as a boy. This was where he had been forced to leave. In 1933, Callum had been 17, tall for his age, thin but restless, his strength not yet settled into his frame. His father, Malcolm, was a hard man with sharp cheekbones and eyes that rarely softened. Malcolm's hair had already begun to thin in his early 40s, his posture rigid, his voice sharp enough to bruise. He had once been quieter, Callum remembered that much, but grief had stripped him of whatever patience he once possessed. When Callum's mother died, something in Malcolm closed permanently, like a door that would never open again. Sarah had been nothing like her husband. She was a gentle woman of medium height, slender but resilient, her movements deliberate and calm. Her chestnut brown hair was usually pulled back loosely, strands escaping no matter how carefully she tied it. Her skin carried a natural warmth, even in winter, and her hands always smelled faintly of soap and bread. She spoke softly, but there was certainty in her voice. She believed kindness was not a feeling, but a practice, something you chose daily. When Callum was young, she used to slip small notes into his coat pocket, reminders to eat, to rest, to be patient with himself. Those small gestures had been the quiet glue that held the household together. When she died, sudden illness, no warning, the balance collapsed. Malcolm drank more, spoke less, and when he did speak, his words carried an edge sharpened by resentment. The house grew tense, the silences longer, the arguments harsher. The final night began over something trivial and ended in irreparable damage. Malcolm accused Callum of weakness, of dreaming instead of obeying. Callum, raw with grief he did not yet know how to name, answered back. The slap came quickly. The order to leave came faster. The door slammed behind him as winter air tore through his thin coat. Callum had wanted to turn back, to grab the last letters his mother had written, the ones she kept in a small metal box beneath the floor near the hearth. But the door was locked. Pride kept him from knocking again. Fear kept him from pleading. He walked away instead, carrying only the certainty that something precious had been left behind. That moment never left him. It did not fade, it hardened. To survive, Callum enlisted, not out of patriotism, but because the uniform was warmer than the streets and quieter than his home. The military offered structure where his life had fractured, rules where emotion had become dangerous. War followed him across continents and years, grinding tenderness down to efficiency. He learned to obey without questioning, to lose men without speaking their names aloud, to keep moving when stopping meant collapse. 30 years passed like a long winter, endless, numbing, effective at erasing softness. Now, standing again inside the ruined house, that numbness began to crack. Buster moved ahead, paws careful on the unstable floor. Callum watched him with the quiet trust that came only from shared danger. The dog stopped abruptly. His posture changed, head lowered, ears rigid, muscles tight beneath aging fur. He sniffed the air once, twice, then pressed his nose against a section of the wooden floor near the center of the room. "Easy," Callum murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Buster ignored him. He scratched at the boards, slow at first, then with growing urgency. Wood splintered, dust rose. The sound cut through the silence like a confession. Callum's chest tightened. He recognized the spot. He dropped to his knees, the cold seeping through his trousers as he helped pry the boards loose. Beneath the rotted planks lay a rusted metal box, small and unremarkable, its surface scarred by moisture and time. His hands hovered above it, trembling. For a moment, he feared opening it, because some truths, once known, could never be returned to the dark. Inside were letters, folded carefully despite their age, edges yellowed, ink faded but legible. His mother's handwriting, gentle, looping, unmistakable. Beneath them lay an old hand-drawn map, creased and worn, marked with a location in Vermont. Callum's breath left him in a quiet rush. The letters spoke of love, of regret, of hope she had never spoken aloud. And they spoke of Tobias Whitlock, his maternal grandfather, a name Malcolm had forbidden, erased from conversation as though it were a betrayal. According to the letters, Tobias had written often, had begged to see his grandson, had waited year after year, refusing to believe Callum's absence was a choice. The name felt unfamiliar, yet strangely heavy, as if it had always been there, waiting. Callum sat back on his heels, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him harder than any battlefield memory. He had believed himself abandoned. He had built his life around that belief, armored his heart against the possibility of being wanted. And all that time, someone had been waiting. Buster settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The dog did not whine or paw. He simply stayed. For the first time in decades, Callum allowed himself to feel the grief fully. Not only for his mother, but for the boy he had been. Locked out in the cold, believing the world had ended. The truth did not erase the pain. It reframed it. And in that reframing, something long frozen began, slowly, to thaw. He folded the letters carefully, placed them back into the box, and closed the lid. Outside, the wind moved through broken trees, but inside the ruined house, Callum felt something he had not felt in 30 years. Direction. Callum left the ruined house before dawn, when the cold was sharp enough to keep emotions contained. What he carried with him now was not the past itself, but the weight of knowing it had never been complete. The sky was a dull slate gray, snow pressed thin and hard against the road, and the engine of his old car hummed with the uneven rhythm of something that had learned to endure without complaint. Buster took the passenger seat as if it had always belonged to him. Nearly 9 years old, the German Shepherd moved with measured economy, no wasted motion, no uncertainty. His thick black and tan coat bristled faintly in the cold, the white creeping along his muzzle more visible in the pale morning light. His amber eyes remained fixed forward, ears alert to sounds beyond Callum's reach. Age had slowed him slightly, but it had not softened him. Discipline lingered in every line of his posture. The road stretched northward, narrow and quiet, threading through frozen fields and low hills. Callum welcomed the monotony. Movement, even slow and deliberate, had always been easier than stillness. Silence inside a vehicle was different from silence inside a house. It could be shaped, paced, controlled. The farther the abandoned home receded behind them, the more space memory found to move. The military had trained Callum to separate feeling from function. Orders came cleanly, without room for interpretation. You acted, you adjusted, you advanced. There was no ceremony for fear, no allowance for doubt. He had learned to sleep lightly, to wake without confusion, to keep his body ready even when his mind resisted. Discipline had been survival. Emotion had been excess. Winter deployments had been the worst. Cold stripped everything down to necessity. Breath became visible, fingers stiffened, and hesitation carried consequences. He remembered his first winter overseas, not the location, but the sensation. Fabric that never quite kept warmth in, boots that froze solid overnight, a kind of quiet that pressed inward, heavy and suffocating. When one of the men fell, too fast, too silent, there had been no pause. Helmets were collected later, never asked for again. Someone else filled the space. The line held. The day moved on. Callum did not think of those moments often. Thinking implied permission, and permission was dangerous. Still, memory had a way of slipping through the smallest cracks. Buster shifted slightly, adjusting his weight as the road curved. The movement was subtle but precise, as if he had sensed something before it arrived. Callum slowed instinctively, scanning the road ahead. A deer crossed quickly, its shape pale against the snow, before vanishing into the trees. Callum exhaled, his grip steady. Reflexes did not disappear with time. They simply learned new contexts. Buster had joined his unit years after Callum enlisted. The dog had been younger then, stronger, restless in a way that demanded purpose. Training had sharpened him, but it was experience that bonded them. Buster learned Callum's silences, the shift in his breathing when memory pressed too close. Callum learned the subtle signals, the way Buster's ears angled forward a fraction too early, the tension in his shoulders before danger announced itself. Trust grew quietly, forged not through affection, but through survival. Driving now, Callum found himself watching Buster from the corner of his eye. The dog sat upright, gaze unwavering, as if escorting something unseen. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. He dismissed it at first, fatigue, imagination, but it returned, persistent. Buster moved like a sentinel, alert not only to the road ahead, but to something behind them as well. Was he only a dog, shaped by training and instinct? Or had the years beside soldiers imprinted something deeper? Callum wondered whether Buster carried memory the way men did, not in images or words, but in posture, in vigilance, in refusal to relax fully. The idea was irrational, but it lingered. Too many men had never made it home. Too many stories had ended without witnesses. They passed through small towns that barely registered, low buildings, muted paint, windows glowing briefly before fading behind them. At a fuel stop, Callum exchanged a few words with the station attendant, a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with a thick, uneven beard and tired eyes. He moved without urgency, hands practiced, demeanor neutral. He did not ask questions. Callum appreciated that. Some journeys demanded anonymity, not recognition. Back on the road, the letters pressed against Callum's thoughts. He had not opened them again. He did not need to. The words were already embedded, unfolding slowly, resisting any attempt to be rushed. Tobias. A grandfather he had never known. A presence erased so completely it had shaped Callum's understanding of absence itself. The idea that someone had been waiting, not demanding, not accusing, simply waiting, felt heavier than rejection ever had. Abandonment was something Callum understood. Expectation was not. As daylight thinned and the sky deepened toward evening, the road narrowed, winding through denser woods. Snow clung stubbornly to branches, sagging under its own weight. Buster let out a low sound, not a bark, not a warning. Just acknowledgement. Callum glanced at him. Their eyes met briefly, then Buster looked forward again. The moment passed, but something in Callum steadied. He was not alone with his thoughts. He had not been alone for years, even when he believed otherwise. The journey began to feel less like movement toward a destination, and more like a stripping away. Each mile loosened something Callum had held too tightly. The boy locked out in the cold. The young soldier who learned to survive without softness. The man who built his life around the belief that no one was waiting. None of them disappeared. They simply stood closer now, demanding acknowledgement. He wondered what Tobias would see when he arrived. A stranger, a soldier, a man shaped by distance and silence. He wondered whether meeting his grandfather would require something he no longer knew how to give. Vulnerability was not a skill the military encouraged, neither was forgiveness. Night fell quickly. Snow began again, light but steady, reflecting in the headlights as the road narrowed into a ribbon of certainty through darkness. Callum drove on, neither hurried nor hesitant. For most of his life, he had reacted, to orders, to circumstance, to loss. This time, he was choosing. The distinction mattered. Buster adjusted his position, resting his head briefly against the door, eyes still open. The gesture was small but grounding. Whatever waited ahead, whatever Tobias represented, it would not be faced alone. Behind them, the abandoned house dissolved fully into darkness. Ahead, the unknown waited, not as an enemy, but as a reckoning long deferred. And between the two, on a winter road carved through silence, a man and his dog continued forward, carrying not only memory, but the fragile possibility of meaning. The granite hills rose cold and bare against the late afternoon sky, their surfaces pale and unforgiving, shaped by centuries of wind and frost. Snow lay thin in the crevices, refusing to melt even under the weak winter sun. Callum slowed the car as the road narrowed into a rutted path, the engine idling low. The air here felt different, older, heavier, as if the land itself remembered more than it revealed. He saw the fire first, a small, uneven flame flickering beside a low stone foundation, its smoke drifting weakly into the gray air. Then the figure beside it came into view. The old man stood bent against the cold, wrapped in a thick, worn coat that had once been dark but had faded into a patchwork of browns and grays. He was small now, his frame thinned by age, but there was a stubborn solidity in the way he braced himself, one hand gripping a short walking stick, the other feeding twigs into the fire with deliberate care. His hair was white and sparse, lying flat against his scalp, and his face was deeply lined, the skin weathered and tight, as if stretched over bone by decades of wind and worry. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from age, and yet each movement was precise, practiced. Callum parked a short distance away and stepped out. The cold cut through him immediately, sharp and familiar. Buster followed, boots crunching softly in the snow. The dog paused, ears lifting, posture alert but calm. He did not bark. For a long moment, none of them moved. The old man noticed them slowly, as if sensing a shift rather than hearing it. He turned his head, eyes clouded but searching, pale blue dulled by time, yet still sharp at the center. His gaze moved from the car to the dog, then finally settled on Callum. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stared, breath visible in the cold air. Callum felt his chest tighten. This was not how reunions were supposed to look. There was no rush forward, no calling of names, no immediate recognition. Just distance, measured in steps and years. He walked closer, stopping a few paces away. Up close, he could see the strain in the old man's posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, protecting something fragile beneath. The fire crackled softly between them. "I'm looking for Tobias Whitlock," Callum said at last. His voice was steady, but only because he forced it to be. The old man's grip on the walking stick tightened. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he bent slowly, reaching for another piece of wood. His fingers fumbled, and the stick slipped from his grasp, falling into the snow with a dull sound. Callum stepped forward instinctively. As he did, he pushed his sleeve back without thinking, the fabric catching briefly at his wrist. The birthmark was unmistakable, a dark curved shape like a hook set against pale skin. The old man froze. The piece of wood dropped from his hand, landing beside the fire. His breath hitched, shallow and uneven. He stared at Callum's wrist as though the world had narrowed to that single point. For a long moment, no one spoke. 30 years of absence closed quietly, not with words, but with recognition. Tobias lowered himself onto the stone foundation, movements careful and slow, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. Tears gathered in his eyes, spilling without sound, tracing paths through the deep lines of his face. He made no attempt to wipe them away. His mouth trembled, working around words that refused to come. Callum stood still, unsure whether to move closer or remain where he was. He had imagined this moment in fragments: anger, accusation, explanation, but none of those fit the reality unfolding in front of him. There was no room here for blame, only for loss. Buster broke the stillness. The German shepherd stepped forward, unhurried, his movements gentle. He approached Tobias, head low, tail still. When he reached the old man, he rested his head carefully against Tobias's knee, the warmth of his body pressing through layers of fabric. Tobias's hand hovered uncertainly, then settled onto the dog's head. His fingers sank into the thick fur, and a quiet sound escaped him, not a sob, but something close to relief. "Good boy," Tobias whispered, his voice thin but steadying. The words seemed to ground him. Callum finally moved closer, kneeling beside the fire. The heat brushed against his hands, weak but real. He could see now how fragile Tobias was, the way his breath came shallow, the faint tremor that never fully left his hands. And yet, beneath the frailty, there was a presence that refused to be erased. This was a man who had waited, not passively, but with endurance. They did not speak for several minutes. There was nothing urgent enough to say. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with what had been lost and what, improbably, remained. Callum's thoughts drifted briefly to his mother, to Sarah's letters, to the careful hope she had folded into words she never expected him to read. He understood now what she had tried to preserve, not answers. Possibility. "I didn't know," Callum said quietly finally. I was told." Tobias nodded once, slowly. "I know," he replied. His voice was rough, shaped by cold and disuse. "I waited anyway." That was all he said. It was enough. The wind moved across the hills, carrying the faint scent of smoke and snow. The fire crackled, fighting the cold with stubborn persistence. Above them, the granite rose, indifferent and enduring, bearing witness without judgment. Callum sat beside Tobias, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Buster remained at Tobias's knee, eyes half-lidded, content. No one spoke of the years gone. No one demanded explanations. The truth had already done its work. Family, Callum realized, did not always arrive with certainty or completeness. Sometimes it arrived late, fragile, and imperfect. But it arrived nonetheless. As the light faded and the cold deepened, the three of them remained by the fire, bound together not by words or blood alone, but by the quiet decision to stay. The first winter after the reunion settled slowly over the granite hills, not with violence, but with quiet insistence. Snow returned to the crevices it had always claimed, and the wind traced the same old paths across stone that had outlasted memory itself. Callum stayed, not because he had decided to, but because leaving no longer made sense. Tobias did not ask him to remain. He simply continued lighting the fire each morning, laying out tools as he always had, as if the presence beside him were inevitable. The old stone foundation became their center. Tobias treated it not as ruin, but as conversation. He spoke to it the way one might speak to a stubborn friend, patiently, without raising his voice. Nearing 90, his body had grown thin and fragile, his back permanently bent, his hands marked by tremor and age spots. But his memory remained precise. His eyes, pale and watery, still tracked lines and angles with an accuracy that surprised Callum. Tobias had spent his life working stone, and the craft had settled into him like a second skeleton. "Stone is not cold," Tobias told Callum one morning, his voice rough but steady as he rested on his walking stick. "It remembers. It holds what you give it." Callum did not argue. He listened. The work began simply: clearing snow, sorting stones by weight and shape, Tobias could no longer lift much, but he knew where each piece belonged. Callum carried the weight, his broad shoulders and disciplined posture returning to a kind of usefulness that did not involve command or consequence. He learned to slow down, to place each stone deliberately, to feel its balance before setting it in place. Strength without patience, Tobias reminded him, only broke things faster. Buster adapted naturally. The German shepherd, now past his prime but still alert, took on a role no one assigned him. He walked ahead of Tobias, stopping at uneven ground, pausing at narrow steps, glancing back to ensure the old man followed safely. His movements were gentle, unhurried. Age had softened his muzzle, but not his purpose. Where Callum had been trained to obey orders, Buster had learned to anticipate need. The days developed a rhythm that required no schedule: morning fires, quiet meals, work until the cold stiffened fingers and joints. Tobias spoke little, but when he did, his words carried intention. He taught Callum how to read stone, the way others read grain in wood, how to recognize fractures hidden beneath the surface, how to let gravity do part of the work. Mortar was used sparingly. Tobias believed stone should trust stone, not glue. Callum found himself changing in ways he did not notice at first. His sleep deepened. His breathing slowed. The sharp vigilance that had defined his movements softened into awareness rather than readiness. The war did not disappear. It simply loosened its grip. He began to understand what Tobias meant when he said stone remembered kindness. The walls they raised felt different from the barriers he had built in his life, solid but not defensive. Sometimes in the evenings, Tobias would sit by the fire and speak of the past. Not explanations, not apologies, just fragments. He spoke of his wife, long gone, of the way she laughed at small inconveniences. He spoke of Sarah, Callum's mother, as a girl, how she had inherited his patience and her mother's quiet strength. Tobias described her as tall for her age, slender, with hair the color of late autumn and eyes that missed nothing. She always believed people could be better, he said once, almost to himself, even when they weren't. Callum listened, absorbing a version of his mother that existed before loss shaped her. The stories did not erase the years between them, but they softened their edges. Spring came slowly. Snow retreated in patches, revealing damp earth and stone darkened by meltwater. The work expanded. Walls rose waist-high, then chest-high. Tobias marked lines with a piece of chalk, his hand steady despite the tremor. Callum followed those lines faithfully. Buster lay nearby, eyes half closed, alert even in rest. The second winter approached differently. The structure they had built held warmth longer, the stone releasing heat slowly as Tobias had promised. Callum understood now. Stone did not reject warmth, it stored it. So did people, he realized, if given the chance. They lived simply. No visitors, no expectation. Tobias's needs were few. Callum learned to read the signs of fatigue in the old man's movements, the slight hesitation before sitting, the longer pauses between breaths. He adjusted without comment. Care did not require announcement. There were moments of quiet joy. A shared meal eaten without words. Tobias laughing softly when Buster insisted on lying directly in the path of work. Callum discovering that his hands, once instruments of survival, could also create. By the end of the second year, the foundation stood transformed, not grand but resolute. The stone walls bore the marks of 2 sets of hands and 1 set of patient eyes. Callum understood then that the work had never been about building alone. It had been about teaching him how to remain. On a cold evening late in 1963, Tobias rested longer than usual by the fire. His breathing was shallow but calm. He watched the walls as if committing them to memory. "You've learned," he said quietly. Callum did not answer. He did not need to. Buster settled beside Tobias, pressing close, steady, and warm. 3 lives, briefly aligned. 3 generations, sharing what time allowed. The years stolen could not be returned, but in their place, something else had been built, something that would endure. The winter of 1963 arrived quietly, without the violence Callum had learned to expect from colder seasons. Snow fell lightly across the granite hills, settling into the familiar grooves of stone and earth. Tobias moved more slowly now, his steps shorter, his breath shallower, but his mornings still began the same way, by the fire, watching the stone walls as if confirming they were still where he had left them. Callum noticed the changes before Tobias acknowledged them. The old man's hands trembled more noticeably, the pauses between movements stretching longer. His eyes, once sharp even through age, often lingered unfocused before finding their mark. Yet, his voice remained steady, his mind clear. Whatever time was taking from his body, it had not touched his resolve. They spoke less about work and more about memory. Tobias no longer corrected Callum's hands unless necessary. The lessons had been given. What remained was understanding. One evening, as the fire burned low and Buster lay nearby, Tobias reached beneath his coat and withdrew a folded bundle of papers, yellowed at the edges and softened by years of handling. He placed them carefully into Callum's hands. "I kept this longer than I should have," Tobias said. His voice carried no regret, only certainty. "It was meant for you." Callum unfolded the pages slowly. The drawings were precise, sketched with a steady hand that betrayed none of the tremor Tobias now carried. Stone foundations anchored the design, familiar and grounded. But rising above them was something new. Arched structures, curved lines that allowed space and light. A marriage of endurance and openness. "It's not meant to shut the world out," Tobias continued. "Stone can protect, but it can also invite. Don't build it like a fortress." Callum studied the drawings, understanding settling in gradually. The design was not just architectural, it was instruction. "You don't survive by hardening forever," Tobias said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "There's a difference between strength and coldness. Promise me you won't confuse them." Callum swallowed, the words pressing against something he had only recently learned to feel again. "I promise," he said quietly. Tobias nodded once, satisfied. He passed in his sleep a few nights later. There was no struggle, no alarm. Callum found him in the early morning, seated as he often was by the fire, his head resting gently against the stone wall. His breathing had simply stopped. His face was calm. The lines of age softened into something like rest. Callum did not speak. He did not need to. Some moments asked for silence, not response. Buster stood nearby, alert but still. He approached Tobias slowly, sniffed once, then lay down beside him, pressing his body close. There was no confusion in the dog's posture, only acknowledgement. They buried Tobias beside the stone foundation, where the earth was firm and familiar. Callum worked methodically, the way he had learned to do difficult things, without haste, without spectacle. The ground resisted at first, frozen hard, but persistence prevailed. Buster stayed close, watching, occasionally nudging Callum's hand, as if to remind him he was not alone. When the grave was finished, Callum lowered Tobias into the ground with care. There were no words spoken aloud. The hills bore witness. The stone held memory. Callum placed the rolled drawings atop the fresh earth for a moment, before lifting them again, imprinting the weight of the promise into himself. He stood there long after the work was done, the cold seeping upward through his boots, the wind moving gently across the hills. "I won't let it freeze me again," he said softly, the words meant as much for himself as for the man beneath the ground. Buster pressed against his leg, solid and warm. As dusk fell, Callum returned to the foundation and spread the drawings across the stone. The design no longer felt like an idea. It felt like obligation, not burdensome, but grounding. Tobias had given him more than reconciliation. He had given him direction. The cold lingered, but it no longer defined the space. Stone, Callum understood now, was not lifeless. It remembered hands, intention, care, and so did people. That night, by the fire that Tobias had lit countless times before, Callum sat with Buster and watched the flames trace familiar patterns against the stone. Grief moved through him quietly, without violence. It did not erase what had been gained. It affirmed it. The promise remained, anchored not in words alone, but in work yet to be done. Spring returned to the granite hills with reluctance, the ground slow to release winter's grip. The stone foundation stood unchanged, but the space around it began to shift. Callum did not mourn long in stillness. Grief, he had learned, could either harden or move. He chose movement. The drawings Tobias had given him were unrolled and studied each morning. Callum traced the arched lines with his finger, committing proportions to memory. Stone would remain the base, as Tobias intended. But above it, Callum envisioned something practical, salvaged, resilient, born of another kind of endurance. He drove farther now, beyond the hills, toward forgotten depots and rusted lots where remnants of the war still waited. The Quonset frames lay scattered like bones of a past no one wanted to remember. Curved steel ribs, pitted and dull, stacked in uneven piles. Callum recognized them instantly. He had lived beneath their arcs overseas, slept through shelling inside their echoing shells. They were not beautiful. They were honest. Light enough to move, strong enough to last. He worked alone most days. His body knew the labor. Steel scraped against gloves. Bolts resisted before yielding. He hauled sections back piece by piece, strapping them down with care. The road back to the foundation became familiar to the townspeople who watched from a distance. They began to talk. At the general store, voices lowered when Callum entered. He noticed the way conversations paused, the way eyes followed him. "That old soldier's gone mad," someone muttered once, not quite quietly enough. Building a bunker on stone like the war never ended. Callum did not correct them. He had no interest in persuading people who preferred fear to understanding. Howard Peaton noticed immediately. Peaton owned most of the surrounding land, parcels inherited and consolidated through decades of acquisition. He was a large man in his late 50s, tall and thick through the chest, with a face carved into hard planes by years of suspicion. His hair was iron gray, combed straight back, his jaw heavy beneath a trim beard that never fully hid the tension in his mouth. His eyes were sharp and restless, always calculating, always measuring what might be taken next. Howard had grown up hungry. That fact shaped everything. He rarely spoke of it, but the scarcity of his youth had etched itself into his posture and temper. Loss had taught him control, land was safety, ownership was survival. Anything left unclaimed felt like a threat. The granite plot Tobias had occupied sat at the edge of Peaton's holdings. Howard had noticed it years earlier, but dismissed it as useless. Stone too hard to work, too exposed, too stubborn. Now, with steel arriving and walls rising, his interest sharpened. He sent men first. Quiet visits, measurements taken from the road, questions asked politely, then not. They came in pairs, boots clean, expressions blank. Callum answered none of them. He worked. The steel began to take shape above the stone. The arched ribs rose, skeletal at first, catching light differently than wood or brick. Callum anchored them carefully, respecting the stone foundation Tobias had taught him to trust. The structure was neither house nor bunker, neither old nor new. It was something in between. Buster remained close. The German shepherd had aged into a deeper stillness. His movements were slower now, but his presence had weight. He positioned himself deliberately, between Callum and strangers, between steel and road, between intention and intrusion. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He stood. When Peaton arrived himself, it was midday. He did not approach immediately. He watched from the edge of the road, hands planted on his hips, assessing. Callum felt the gaze before he saw the man. "You planning to live in that thing?" Peaton called out, voice loud enough to carry, casual enough to feign curiosity. Callum set down his tools. He turned, meeting Peaton's stare without haste. "I'm building," he said simply. Peaton's mouth tightened. "On land that doesn't belong to you." Callum glanced at the stone beneath his boots. "It does?" Peaton laughed once, short and humorless. "We'll see." Buster stepped forward then, placing himself squarely between them, his head lifted slightly, eyes steady, body unmoving. The message was clear without sound. Peaton noticed the dog. His gaze lingered, calculation shifting. He had seen men flinch before. He did not flinch now, but he did not step closer either. "Keep your animal under control," Peaton said, though his tone lacked conviction. Callum did not move Buster. He had learned when to intervene and when to let presence speak. Peaton left without further comment. The men he had brought with him followed, glancing back once, uneasy. The visits continued, pressure applied in small ways, supplies delayed, rumors circulated. The name Mad Soldier stuck. Callum let it. Labels were easier for people than understanding work they could not categorize. The steel frame rose higher. The stone walls remained unyielding. Callum worked with precision Tobias would have approved of, letting structure serve function, not ego. The arches allowed space for light. The stone anchored warmth. Nothing was ornamental. Everything had purpose. At night, Callum sat with Buster inside the half-built shell, the wind passing harmlessly overhead. He thought of Tobias's words, strength without coldness, protection without isolation. Peyton returned once more, alone this time. He stood at the boundary, watching as Callum tightened bolts. "You think you're proving something," Peyton said, "but men like you don't last. You build walls because you don't trust what's outside them." Callum paused, considering the man. "I build walls," he replied, "because I know what they're for." Peyton's eyes narrowed. For a moment, something else flickered there. Recognition, perhaps, or the echo of his own hunger. Then it was gone. Buster stood, unmoving. Peyton left again. This time, he did not look back. The structure stood by the end of the season, incomplete but unmistakable, steel and stone, joined without apology. Callum stepped back, evaluating. It was not a fortress meant to repel the world. It was a shelter meant to endure it. The town would decide what to call it. Callum already knew what it was. The problem revealed itself quietly. No collapse, no sudden failure. Just a hairline shift that Callum felt through his boots before he saw it with his eyes. One corner of the ancient stone foundation had begun to settle unevenly, a slow surrender to time and frost. The walls above remained firm, but the ground beneath them spoke in subtler warnings. Stone, Tobias had taught him, always told the truth if you listen long enough. Callum knelt and pressed his palm against the rock. Cold radiated upward, steady and honest. This foundation was older than any of them, assembled by hands that trusted gravity more than binding. Mortar had been spared, not out of scarcity, but intention. The stones were meant to lock together, each bearing its share of the load. Over decades, frost had wedged itself into the seams, loosening what patience had once secured. There was only one way forward. Callum would have to dismantle the failing section, stone by stone, recut edges where time had rounded them, and set them again, dry, precise, unyielding to error. The work would not be quick. It could not be. He began at dawn, tools laid out in careful order, hammer, chisel, measuring square worn smooth by use. Each stone was marked, lifted, set aside. Some were too heavy to move without leverage. Others crumbled slightly at the edges, revealing fractures hidden beneath a solid face. Callum adjusted, learning the temperament of each piece. He did not force them. Force, Tobias had warned, was the enemy of fit. Buster stayed close, a constant weight at Callum's side. The German shepherd had learned the rhythms of work as thoroughly as any command. When Callum rose, Buster shifted. When Callum knelt, Buster settled. His muzzle had grayed further, his joints stiffened by cold, but his attention never wavered. He watched the edges, the shadows, the places where distraction crept in. The days blurred into repetition. Remove, shape, test, reset. Callum worked until his shoulders burned and his hands went numb, then worked longer. When rain came, it came cold, soaking through gloves and sleeves, turning stone slick and unforgiving. His fingers swelled, skin splitting where pressure and wetness met. Blood marked the rock in the thin lines that washed away with the rain. At night, he worked by lantern light. The beam cast hard shadows, exaggerating angles and seams. Precision mattered more in darkness. One mistake could propagate through the structure, undoing days of effort. Callum slowed further, breathing measured, movements deliberate. He thought of Tobias's chalk lines, of the old man's insistence on patience. Buster lay close beneath the lantern, his body pressed against Callum's leg when the cold deepened. When Callum paused to bind a hand, Buster licked the blood away with careful attention, then rested his head against Callum's knee, as if anchoring him to the present. There was no drama in the gesture, just continuity. Stone by stone, the puzzle took shape. Callum learned which edges required correction and which should be left alone. He learned how weight traveled downward, how pressure redistributed itself through contact points no wider than a finger. Each stone seated correctly produced a sensation he could feel in his chest, a quiet alignment, a rightness that needed no confirmation. The townspeople noticed the lights burning late. Some slowed their cars as they passed. A few stopped briefly, curiosity edging out skepticism. No one offered help. Callum did not ask. This work demanded solitude. Howard Peaton came once, near dusk, and watched from the road. He said nothing. His eyes tracked the pattern emerging at the base, the careful interlock. For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed his face. He left without comment. Weeks passed. The weather turned harsher. Rain shifted to sleet to snow. Callum adjusted his schedule, working whenever conditions allowed. He slept little, ate simply, conserved energy for precision. The war had taught him how to endure deprivation. Tobias had taught him why endurance mattered. One night, as he set the final stone of the rebuilt section, Callum felt the difference immediately. The structure settled, not downward but inward, load distributed, tension resolved. He stepped back, testing with his weight. The foundation held, not rigid, but balanced. He sat on the cold stone and let the lantern burn low. His hands throbbed, swollen and split. He wrapped them carefully, one at a time. Buster shifted closer, warmth pressing into Callum's side. Callum realized then that the work had done more than stabilize stone. Each correct placement had answered something inside him that words never had. Discipline without cruelty, strength without isolation, repair that did not erase history, but honored it. He rose at dawn to inspect the work in daylight. The seams were clean. The stones spoke to one another as Tobias had promised. The puzzle was complete, not because it was finished forever, but because it now made sense. Callum cleaned his tools and stored them. He placed his palm once more against the stone, feeling the cold that no longer felt hostile. It remembered his hands. He could feel it. Buster stood beside him, steady and silent. Another piece of a life had been set correctly. The structure above would endure because the foundation beneath it had been made honest again. The winter of 1964 did not arrive as a warning. It descended like a verdict. The sky darkened for days without clearing, clouds layering upon one another until the sun became a rumor. Snow began lightly, then returned with insistence, driven sideways by wind that howled through the granite hills like something alive. Roads disappeared first, then fences, then entire stretches of familiar ground. Rutland fell silent, cut off from the rest of the world, as if erased. Modern houses suffered quickly. Roofs built for convenience bowed under the accumulating weight. Their lines never meant to carry such pressure. Heating systems failed one by one as power lines snapped, plunging neighborhoods into darkness. Windows frosted from the inside. Pipes burst. The storm found every weakness that had been overlooked in gentler seasons. Callum watched it all from within the stone house. The structure did not groan. It did not protest. The granite walls absorbed the cold without surrendering what they had stored. Heat gathered slowly during the brief daylight hours, held deep within the stone, then released at night in a steady, patient warmth. It was not comfort in the modern sense, but it was survival. Quiet, reliable, earned. Inside, the air remained still. The wind struck the curved steel above and flowed over it, deflected rather than resisted. Snow piled high against the exterior, but the arches shed weight naturally, allowing drifts to slide away instead of accumulating. Callum had not built for beauty. He had built for weather. He moved deliberately through the space, checking seams, listening for change. Years of war had taught him how to read environments under pressure. Silence here was a sign of success, not absence. Buster lay near the stone floor, his body stretched long, eyes half closed. The German shepherd had chosen his place carefully. Callum noticed the way the dog shifted slightly as the night deepened, pressing closer to the ground, where warmth rose subtly from the granite beneath. His breath was slow, steady, untroubled. Outside, the storm raged white and blind. Callum remembered other storms, sand carried by winds so fierce it stripped skin raw, rain that turned roads to rivers in minutes. But this was different. Snow erased sound, muffled everything beyond the walls. The world felt reduced to what remained inside the stone. At night, Callum sat by the small fire, feeding it sparingly. He did not need much. The walls did their work. He thought of Tobias, of the old man's insistence that stone remembered kindness. He wondered if this was what Tobias had meant. Not sentiment, but continuity. Care passed forward through decisions made long before the storm arrived. The town beyond the hills struggled. Callum could see faint glows where generators still held, hear the distant crack of trees surrendering under ice. He imagined families huddled together, breath visible in dark rooms, waiting for morning that did not promise relief. The storm pressed on for days. Snowdrifts rose higher than fences, burying landmarks entirely. Wind carved new shapes across the land, filling valleys and scouring ridges. The temperature dropped relentlessly, cold sharpening until even movement felt costly. Rutland was no longer a town. It was an island of endurance. Inside the stone house, time slowed. Callum slept in intervals, waking to check conditions, to add wood, to ensure nothing had shifted. Each morning, he found the structure unchanged. Each night, the warmth remained. Buster moved occasionally, padding softly across the stone, then returning to his chosen place. Callum watched him once, noting how the dog's chest rose and fell in rhythm with the house itself. It struck him then that Buster trusted the stone without question. Animals recognize safety without analysis. Perhaps that was a kind of wisdom. On the fourth night, the storm reached its peak. Wind hammered against the steel, snow driving horizontally with such force that visibility vanished entirely. Callum stood at the door for a moment, hand pressed against the frame, feeling the pressure without yielding. He thought of the houses he had seen collapse years ago under lesser strain. He thought of Tobias's chalk lines, of the careful interlock of stone beneath his feet. The house held. As the storm began to exhaust itself, its fury spent, a different quiet emerged. Not the muffled silence of snowfall, but the deep stillness that follows survival. Callum opened the door cautiously. The world beyond was unrecognizable, white from ground to sky, contours softened, familiar distances erased. He stepped back inside and closed the door again. There would be time later to face what the storm had taken. For now, he sat on the stone floor beside Buster, resting his back against the wall. The warmth rose steadily, a slow breath beneath them. Buster shifted closer, resting his head on Callum's thigh. His body radiated calm. Outside, the cold remained absolute. Inside, something older and more patient prevailed. Callum closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement. The house had proven itself, not as a monument, not as defiance, but as shelter in its truest form. The storm had tested everything. Stone had remembered. The storm had not finished speaking. Though the wind had softened, snow still moved in sheets across the hills, the night dense and directionless. Callum was tending the fire when Buster rose suddenly, body rigid, ears pinned forward. The German shepherd's low growl cut through the quiet, then sharpened into a bark, short, urgent, unlike anything Callum had heard from him before. Buster did not wait. He bolted for the door, throwing his weight against it. Snow rushed in as Callum opened it, the cold immediate and biting. Visibility was poor, the world reduced to shifting white and shadow. Buster paused only long enough to look back, eyes bright with insistence, then plunged forward into the storm. Callum trusted him. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a shovel and rope, and followed without hesitation. Years of war had taught him when to question and when to act. This was the latter. He kept Buster's dark shape in sight as they moved down slope, wind tearing at clothing, snow filling every sound. The ground fell away more steeply than Callum expected. He slowed, probing with his boot, feeling for stability. Then he heard it. A faint sound, almost lost to the wind. Metal groaning. A human voice, thin and panicked. They found the vehicle half buried at the edge of a ravine, its rear wheels lifted uselessly. its front end swallowed by snow and darkness. The engine was silent. The windshield was cracked, webbed with ice. Buster circled once, barking sharply, then stopped at the passenger side door. Inside were 4 people. Howard Peaton was slumped over the steering wheel, blood dried at his temple, his face gray with cold and shock. He looked smaller now, stripped of posture and authority, reduced to breath and need. Beside him sat a woman in her early 40s, his wife, Margaret, her frame slight beneath a heavy coat, dark hair plastered to her face with snowmelt. Her eyes were wide, focused entirely on the child in the back seat. The boy could not have been more than 6. His body shook violently, lips blue, breath shallow and uneven. He whimpered weakly, too cold to cry. Callum did not waste time on assessment beyond what mattered. He anchored the rope to a nearby tree, secured himself, and climbed down to the vehicle. Snow collapsed under his weight, threatening to give way. He moved carefully, methodically, as he had learned to do under fire. He opened the rear door with effort, hinges protesting. Cold poured in. The child cried out, a thin sound that cut through the storm. "It's all right," Callum said, his voice firm, steady. "I've got you." Howard stirred at the sound. His eyes focused slowly, confusion giving way to recognition. "You," he rasped, disbelief mixing with fear. "You shouldn't—" Callum cut him off gently. "Hold still." He freed the child first, wrapping him tightly in his coat, shielding the small body from wind and snow. Buster stepped forward immediately, pressing his broad chest against the child, radiating warmth. The dog lay down, curling protectively, his breath slow and deep. The child's shaking eased slightly. Callum worked quickly after that. Margaret was conscious, though her fingers were numb and clumsy. He guided her up the slope with the rope, his grip unyielding. Howard was last. The larger man was heavier, weaker than Callum expected. He slipped once, panic flaring, but Callum braced and held, hauling him upward inch by inch. When they reached level ground, Callum directed them toward the stone house without discussion. There was no other option. Inside, warmth enveloped them. The contrast was immediate and startling. Margaret gasped softly, tears freezing on her lashes as the heat returned sensation to her skin. Callum laid the child near the fire. Buster settled beside him at once, body pressed close, fur thick and warm. Howard sank onto the stone floor, shaking uncontrollably now, whether from cold or something deeper, Callum could not tell. He stared at the walls, the fire, the dog, as if seeing them for the first time. "You came back," Howard said finally, his voice hoarse. "After everything." Callum knelt, checking the child's breathing. "There was no choice," he replied. Howard laughed weakly, a sound that held no humor. "I would have left you," he admitted. The words fell out of him, raw and unguarded. "I thought strength meant holding on to what's yours." Callum met his gaze briefly. "Strength is knowing when to give," he said. He did not accuse. He did not forgive. He stated a fact. The child slept eventually, color returning slowly to his cheeks. Buster did not move, his head resting near the boy's chest, breath steady and reassuring. Margaret watched the dog with a gratitude she could not speak. Howard bowed his head, shoulders sagging inward. Something had cracked open. For the first time, he was not measuring land or loss. He was measuring warmth, and recognizing it had come without condition. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat. Inside, something irrevocable had changed. The storm did not leave behind silence. It left need. When the roads slowly reopened and the snowdrifts were cut back into something passable, people began to arrive at the stone house without invitation. Some came on foot, wrapped in too thin coats. Others arrived in trucks that rattled with exhaustion, engines coughing after days in the cold. They came carrying blankets, children, quiet fear, and the unspoken question of how one house had remained standing when so many others had failed. Callum did not turn anyone away. The stone structure became something it had never been designed to be, and yet had always intended to serve as a place that held. The fire burned steadily. Granite walls released their warmth without complaint. People slept along the floor, leaned against stone, shared food without ceremony. The house did not feel crowded, it felt purposeful. Buster moved among them with slow authority. Age had settled into his joints now. His gait stiffened slightly, but his presence remained grounding. Children reached for his fur instinctively, drawn by the calm he carried. He tolerated their touch with patience, eyes half closed, as if aware that his work was no longer vigilance but reassurance. Howard Peaton returned 2 days later. He arrived alone this time, without posture or entourage. The man who stepped into the stone house was visibly changed. His shoulders were no longer squared for confrontation, but curved inward with something like humility. The sharpness in his eyes had dulled, replaced by an uncertainty that had not lived there before. His beard was untrimmed, gray threaded more heavily through it than Callum remembered. He looked older, not from age, but from recognition. Peaton stood near the entrance for a long moment, removing his gloves slowly, as if each movement required decision. Conversations quieted. People watched. "I owe you," he said finally, his voice rough, "and I owe this land." He produced a folded set of papers from inside his coat. The documents were worn but intact, land deeds signed and witnessed. He placed them on the stone table without flourish. "I was wrong," Peaton continued. The words did not come easily, but they came honestly. "I thought survival meant possession. I thought warmth was something you took and kept. I was wrong." He looked at Callum directly. There was no challenge in his gaze now, only acknowledgement. Callum nodded once. He did not respond with triumph or absolution. Acceptance did not require performance. Peaton turned to the room. "I'm sorry," he said, louder now. "To all of you, I let fear decide for me." No one applauded. No one demanded more. The apology settled where it needed to. In the weeks that followed, the valley changed. People began to ask questions, not about ownership, but about method. They watched how stone held heat, how walls were angled, how patience replaced speed. Callum taught when asked, not as authority, but as participant. He showed them how to sort stone by shape, how to let gravity do its work, how not to rush what needed time. A young couple, Daniel and Ruth, both in their early 30s, hands rough from farm labor, were among the first to try. Daniel was tall and broad, his face open and earnest, while Ruth was smaller, dark-haired, her skin weathered by wind and work. They argued quietly over stone placement, then laughed when it failed, learning as they went. Others followed. Walls rose slowly across the valley, not uniform, not perfect, but intentional. Children gathered to watch, curious. One boy, no older than 8, stood near Callum one afternoon as he adjusted a corner stone. The child was thin, sharp-eyed, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too large. "Why don't you use cement?" the boy asked, genuinely puzzled. Callum paused, considering the question. He wiped his hands on his trousers and smiled, not wide, but real. "Cement holds stone to stone," he said. "Patience holds people to people." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but remembering the words anyway. As spring approached, the valley felt different, not warmer by temperature alone, but by presence. People lingered longer in one another's company. Fires were shared. Walls became meeting points rather than boundaries. On a quiet evening, Callum sat on the porch of the stone house, watching the light fade across the hills. He was 48 now. His body bore the marks of work and time, but his posture had eased. Beside him lay Buster, older, slower, his breathing deep in content. The dog's muzzle was fully gray now, his eyes softer, but his trust remained absolute. They watched families move between houses, laughter carrying faintly on the air. The valley no longer felt empty. Callum rested his hand on the stone beside him. It was cool, steady, familiar. No one in Rutland would face the cold alone again. In the end, this was never just a story about stone, snow, or survival. It was a story about what happens when a heart chooses not to freeze. Callum returned to a ruined home, expecting only silence, but what he found instead was purpose. Through patience, kindness, and quiet courage, one man and his loyal dog became a living reminder that healing does not come from walls meant to shut others out, but from shelter meant to bring people together. Some might call it coincidence. Others might call it resilience. But perhaps it was something more. Perhaps it was a quiet miracle. One of those gentle works of God that doesn't arrive with thunder, but with warmth. A reminder that when we choose compassion over fear, forgiveness over pride, and service over possession, God can turn even the coldest valleys into places of life. In our daily lives, we all face storms, moments when the world feels harsh, isolating, or unbearably cold. May this story remind you that no one is meant to endure those winters alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, kindness, and healing can reach those who need them. May God bless you, keep you warm in every season, and fill your life with peace, strength, and love.